Today I want to talk about when your past self is still running the show and you're seeking to assert a sense of agency from your current values in the now of your life. And often what happens is the past version of ourselves is still making the decisions and running the show because we haven't caught our breath, kind of update how we interface with our lives, how we make decisions, or even update the default decisions that we're actually making because of psychological fatigue, because we're tired mentally, and creating that space and taking that time and exerting the effort to overcome that willpower speed bump requires a willpower tax, a decision tax that comes from a reserve that we don't actually have, an emotional, energetic reserve that we don't have. So we need to find a way to access psychological, energetic resources to apply to our lives to assert a modernization of our decision-making and habits that is aligned with who we are today rather than who we were, which has set the pattern for how we got where we are. So where does the main problem come from? This problem of being tired, this problem of living my old life even though it doesn't reflect who I am because I am exhausted. So persistent psychological fatigue often emerges not from the workload that you have in your life, but from the cognitive dissonance between your current evaluative stance and previously established behavioral framework. This condition is not typically marked by confusion, like why am I acting this way? You understand that this is a previous version of yourself. But this condition is typically marked by the breakdown in alignment between ongoing actions and present-day judgments. So the result is not a burnout in the conventional sense. It's actually interpretive fatigue. The mind is continuing to execute a plan it no longer believes in. So what I want to do today is outline how that dissonance arises, how it's sustained, and what is required to resolve it without collapsing your sense of coherence, and to be able to, again, assert self-authorship in the behavioral domain of your life based on the psychological domain of your life, because right now that dissonance is creating exhaustion and despair. So what is the condition that we're actually in? The condition is that we have behavioral continuity from a past version of ourselves that no longer aligns with us. And that behavioral continuity is in alignment with an evaluative correspondence. So most of your plans in your life that have ordered why you live the way that you live every day, most of these plans, these career trajectories that you're on, relationship patterns that you have, self-optimization routines, or self-sabotage routines, these are constructed under conditions of perceived clarity. You think you see things clearly. The values guiding those structures may have been initially endorsed, but over time, your evaluative frame evolves. What was once regarded as optimal may now be asserted as irrelevant or misaligned or insufficient. And when action continues based on those irrelevant or misaligned or insufficient values, that when action continues without a corresponding revision in underlying justification, then the individual, or you or me, begins to experience a vague, diffuse psychological resistance to your own routine. And this resistance is frequently misattributed to fatigue or to distraction or to burnout. Oh, I just can't do it, or I'm having brain fog, or right, something like that. But in fact, these symptoms are a rational symptom of something deeper. It's a signal. The outputs in your life no longer correspond to the inputs that once made them meaningful. The rationale for why you're living your life this way has been deprecated. It's been archived. It's been rendered as obsolete, but the behaviors have not. The commitments have not. The time allocations and the emotional budget that you've allocated, these things still reflect a system of values you don't hold. So the question is, why does this system actually persist? Why do you continue to do things that you don't actually believe in? Well, behavioral systems, especially systems that are rewarded externally, they carry inertia, social reinforcements, perceived sunk costs. I've been doing this too long, right? And identity commitments make revision cognitively expensive. So consequently, you and me and individuals in this situation often preserve structural continuity in their lives by deferring internal reevaluation. In other words, change is hard, right? The avoidance of making these kinds of changes to update our behaviors in alignment with our values is rarely a conscious one, because it's not one that we have to do often, because we're not in the habit of updating our actions to reflect our values, because our values don't often change. So it just doesn't occur to us. So we continue in this dissonance. We continue in this state of identity behavioral incoherence. And more often, the avoidance of changing your behaviors, changing your life, shifting your job, leaving that relationship, putting up those boundaries, right? Starting that thing or ending that thing. The avoidance of doing those things is often procedural, right? Like the task to do it is still on the calendar. Like your calendar interface, your digital calendar interface still reflects the old you, still reflects the original model. The individual you continues, not because they remain convinced, but because the cost of contradiction exceeds the cost of maintenance. So this is not irrational, it's efficient. It's efficient to live incoherently because it allows us to avoid the energy costs associated with constant revision. But over time, that efficiency begins to degrade subjective coherence and converts very rapidly into inefficiency insofar as it manifests as cognitive fatigue, emotional burnouts, and even brain fog or physical fatigue. So here we come into the concept of narrative identity and interpretive responsibility, which I know is a hard shift into a more philosophical frame. But I want to draw from a book that I read when I was in my doctoral program, like over 10 years ago. But I read this in my master's program, like 12, 13 years ago. But it's a philosopher named Paul Ricoeur, and the book is called Oneself as Another. And Ricoeur defines identity, personal identity, as a fixed, not as a fixed substance, but as an ongoing act of self-narration. So identity is not something I am. Identity is the story I tell myself about who I am. So for Ricoeur, coherence, identity coherence, self-authorship, coherence and self-authorship is not achieved by maintaining the same story over time. It's achieved by updating the story to account for new experiences and new judgments and new values. And in this model, failure to revise your story is not an act of discipline or willpower. It's a refusal to accept interpretive responsibility for your life. So you preserve the old trajectory of your life, not because it continues to serve you, but because it's actually easier than absorbing the dissonance of discontinuity and having to make those updates. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do I know if what I'm experiencing is that? How do I know if what I'm experiencing isn't just actually fatigue or exhaustion? So there's a few indicators that what you're experiencing is narrative incoherence in the Ricoeurian sense. Number one, your verbal justification exceeds your internal endorsement. So what that means is that you continue to articulate reasons for your actions that no longer reflect current evaluative commitment, right? You're basically over-explaining yourself. The second is that action is preserved to avoid revising prior commitments. So behavioral continuity, you keep doing the same things is prioritized over conceptual alignment, often to prevent undermining past decisions, right? So you don't want to face the fact that you actually, if you changed things now, it would kind of condemn the way you've been living for the past however long year or whatever, right? And that's a little bit too much to own up to. So verbal justification exceeds internal endorsement. Action is preserved to avoid revising prior commitments or maybe facing up to the possibility that you've been making a mistake. And then third, a decline in evaluative engagement with outcomes. So your execution persists, but the subjective relevance of outcomes is no longer actively monitored or interpreted. In other words, you kind of stop caring about why the results are what they are, or even what the results are. So when these markers are present, then you're enacting a past framework likely. And the psychological cost is not the effort of action, but the cognitive dissonance of no longer believing in the action's premise. So this is where we arrive at this concept of identity debt, which is the cost of deferred revision. The longer that your behavioral plan or your system of habits in your life is preserved without reevaluation, the greater the burden of what may be termed identity debt, which we've actually talked about before. Identity debt is the accumulation of unexamined assumptions about what you're doing and why. So this condition doesn't typically manifest in a crisis. Instead, it emerges gradually as a pattern of muted dissatisfaction and withdrawal from meaningful engagement and intermittent detachment from your own decisions. This plan still works, but it no longer belongs to the person who's executing it, which is you. So, resolution requires interpretive disruption. It requires an acute act. And this resolution is not motivational. It's epistemic, which means it has to do about the judgments you make about how you know what you know. Are you willing to face up to the fact that the current life you're living does not reflect your current system of values? Your mind has to be forced to re-engage with its own framework of justification. And that re-engagement often requires a disruptive event, a self-disruptive event, the introduction of contradiction, the encounter with a failure, or the collapse of an external incentive structure, right? And absent that disruption, your system tends to self-preserve. And this is what happens with a lot of people, is they go on living their lives, their entire life, as lives that they don't actually want to live. But there is an undisruptive external incentive structure that keeps the carrot in front of them, so they keep on walking down a path that is not aligned with them. And they never assert the self-authorship to disrupt that hypnosis that they are under by that reward system, by that incentive structure. So what they have to do is they have to revise the path they're on by disrupting it, by failing, by exiting, by creating some kind of chaos or disjuncture that's often very painful and often very costly. But again, it seems costly in comparison to maintaining the system that I'm on, maintaining the behavioral path that I'm on. Disrupting that feels costly. But that's in contrast to the felt experience of comfort, not in contrast to the long arc. So this short cost of disrupting my system to reassert my values now so that I'm living a life now that's in alignment with what I feel and what I believe and what I want. But that cost of disruption has to be contrasted with the long arc, the long cost of staying on a path and living a whole life that does not feel aligned with myself. Right? Staying in a relationship for my whole life just because it would be hard to end it now. Staying in a job for the next 10 years just because I'm scared of leaving one now, or it'd be hard to find a new one now, right? Like that is the real cost. That's the highest cost you could pay. But it doesn't feel that way because you're paying it like a day at a time, right? And so the revision process is not comfortable, and it requires tolerating a temporary period of narrative instability, which can be psychologically difficult to endure, during which you have to reject existing structures before new ones have been fully articulated. but this is not dysfunction. And people looking on in your life might say it's dysfunction. You're changing everything. This looks like a lot of transition. I would stay, and I've done a series on advice. People give advice to optimize for their own lack of liability, not to give you the maximum helpful or useful advice. So don't always listen to people's advice, but just remember, when you're disrupting your life in a major way, out of a pursuit of aligning your behaviors in your current life with your values and your beliefs and your wants in your current self, that's not dysfunction. And a lot of people can't see that from the outside. What that is the condition for genuine self-alignment. So, to wrap all this up, you've got to exit the loop that you're in. Exit the loop by re-engaging in evaluation of your life. You stop, the highlights here are stop evading your life and stop evading that sense of dissonance and dissatisfaction. And when you feel tired and you feel exhausted, I want you to think of times in your life when you had high output and high demand on your life and high obligation on your life, and it stimulated you and gave you energy. And ask yourself, why isn't this situation doing that? So it's not about the load. It's not about the volume of work. It's about the level of alignment that your current work has with who you are. And when a behavioral system persists past the point of internal endorsement, then it creates a double bind. Continuing feels hollow, but stopping feels incoherent. And the only viable exit is not through force, but through reflection. So the task is not to abandon action, but to restore the link between your actions and your judgments. And until that link is reestablished, your current life will continue executing, and you'll still continue to pay the price of living a life that is not aligned with you. And every day that price gets higher and higher. And the person executing these things, the person living this life, is you. You continue to incur that cost. And what I implore you to do is pay the short-term, much higher cost of disrupting the life you're in to achieve alignment. Start over. Feel the disappointment and confusion of starting anew from a position of authenticity and alignment, and build your life based on that. Because then this exhaustion that you feel, this dissonance you feel, this disappointment, this fatigue, this anxiety will have no excuse and will not have any rationale to appeal to. And that internal sense of self you have will know. You will have a knowing that as difficult as this is, as tough as this is, as much self-doubt and imposter syndrome and insecurity as I might have, I still know that it is in alignment with who I am. And that is enough to, and that sense of alignment and carry all of those other emotions, where all of those other emotions, when they are soothed or placated by this misaligned life that you're living, cannot overcome or bear or compensate for the disappointment that comes from a lack of alignment in your life. So pay the short-term price of disrupting your comfortable life now to align it with who you are, then start from scratch, and you will, in the long term, over the long arc, feel a much greater sense of satisfaction and a much higher sense of stimulation and energetic sourcing that you can get from your daily tasks, because they are connected to who you are and what you want to be doing.